The Ukrainian army is gradually changing the nature of its war with Russia, relying on the massive use of drones and strikes against the enemy's logistics hubs. These new tactics are already influencing not only the situation on the front but also the behavior of the Russian leadership, writes Ukrainian writer and The Hill columnist Igor Bondar. The latest Ukrainian drone attacks on targets deep behind Russian lines have demonstrated the Ukrainian Armed Forces' ability to strike from over 1,000 kilometers away. The targets included oil terminals and port infrastructure, which are vital to the Russian economy and military logistics. In particular, Ukrainian forces have repeatedly attacked the oil terminal in Tuapse and also launched strikes on the ports of Primorsk and Ust-Luga. At the same time, Ukrainian drones are striking air defense systems and military installations far from the front line. Ukraine is increasingly shifting from classic offensive operations to a so-called technological siege model. This model involves not encircling cities with tanks and infantry, but rather blocking enemy logistics with drones. This tactic already allows for control of transport routes in the occupied territories and creates serious difficulties for the transfer of Russian equipment and ammunition. In the wake of the Ukrainian attacks, Russian President Vladimir Putin's rhetoric has also changed. While he previously regularly used derogatory language toward the Ukrainian government, he has recently become much more reserved in his comments about President Volodymyr Zelensky and even admits the possibility of personal contacts. Observers attribute this to the growing threats to Russian territory and the significant losses suffered by the Russian military machine. Bondar asserts that for the first time in a long time, Russian troops are facing problems not only on the battlefield but also in the rear. He assesses that the attacks on logistics, personnel losses, and the gradual depletion of resources indicate a weakening of Moscow's position. The author concludes, "The Ukrainian army is changing its warfare tactics by introducing a model of technological siege of occupied territories." In his opinion, if the current trend continues, the occupied territories could become a zone of constant danger for Russian troops, and Russia itself will face increasing difficulties in continuing the war. As a reminder, Reuters previously reported that the Kremlin faced a choice between economic collapse and cutting its war budget. A right-wing American influencer, a sitting U.S. official and a German retail billionaire are scheduled to attend Kremlin dictator Vladimir Putin's Russian Davos, as the Kremlin grapples with stagnant economic growth and a standoff with the West over the war in Ukraine. The war is making its full impact, even if Ukraine isn't mentioned once in the official program. The question is, will this war end, or will a much more difficult future await us, said one Russian participant, speaking on condition of anonymity. Putin, Russia's supreme leader as president or prime minister since 1999, has delivered a massive boost to prosperity in the first 15 years of his rule. According to the International Monetary Fund, the economy grew tenfold, reaching approximately $2.3 trillion in 2013, a year before Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine. Since then, Russia's economy has been paying the price for its confrontation with the West over Ukraine. Despite better-than-expected growth in 2023 and 2024, it is projected to be around $2.9 trillion this year, a fraction of the NATO alliance's combined economic power, estimated at $45 trillion, according to Russian government data. Russia's commodity-dependent economy slowed sharply to about 1% growth last year, down from 4.9% in 2024, and contracted 0.2% in the first quarter of 2026, which officials blamed on high interest rates, Western sanctions and a strong ruble. Growth this year is now forecast at a modest 0.4%. Oleg Vyugin, a former deputy governor of the central bank, said Russia has a choice between recession or cutting funding for what the Kremlin calls the special military operation in Ukraine. Russia faces a choice: either reduce military funding, which would stimulate economic growth through a more rapid reduction in the key interest rate, expand lending to the civilian sector, partially lift sanctions, and restore supply chains, or continue the military-industrial complex, which will continually require increased spending and further tax increases, further accelerating the economy's slide into recession and a decline in real incomes, Vyugin explained. Media previously reported that Putin believes Russia will win and has a false understanding of the situation at the front. Analysts note that the Kremlin dictator likely refuses to cut defense spending because he believes Russia is capable of achieving victory at the front. Analysts say Putin is likely reluctant to cut defense spending because he believes Russia is capable of winning on the front lines. Putin is reportedly resisting pressure to cut defense spending and end the war against Ukraine, despite warnings from economic officials about unsustainable strain on the economy, the ISW report said. Analysts emphasize that the Kremlin's decision may be due to a distorted assessment of the situation at the front. Putin likely has a false understanding of the situation on the battlefield, shaped by exaggerated statements from the Russian military command, analysts note. At the same time, the report emphasizes that cutting military spending could create risks for Russian units on the front, especially in the face of Ukrainian medium-range strikes and counterattacks. Analysts add that the Kremlin's current strategy could further deplete the Russian economy, which is already under significant pressure from sanctions and the war. Bloomberg previously reported that the Russian economy is increasingly feeling the pressure of the war in Ukraine. Growth has nearly stalled, and the budget deficit is growing amid rising military spending. Thus, the economic consequences of the war are gradually starting to work against the Kremlin leader, but he has no plans to stop. Bloomberg also noted that Russian officials are increasingly warning the dictator that Russia can no longer afford the costs of the war with Ukraine. This is a serious sign of internal discord within the Kremlin. Russian economists from the Ministry of Finance and the central bank say that continuing the war will lead to a dangerous increase in the state budget deficit. The publication's sources say that reviving the economy from its precarious state will be extremely difficult. However, disagreements have emerged among politicians, defense ministry officials and some Kremlin officials, determined to pursue Putin's military goals, insist on maintaining military spending. They believe cutting it would seriously damage the economy, as many businesses depend on military-related contracts, the article states. Sources also reported that Putin has ordered cuts to all spending except military spending. The Ministry of Defense, however, is not only resisting the cuts but is also demanding additional funding. Military spending, on the contrary, is slated to increase to cover a $36 billion budget deficit. Journalists write that at the time the budget was drafted, there were hopes that the war would end after the Alaska summit. But that didn't happen, and now Putin faces a difficult choice, responding to domestic warnings about the consequences of war. His disappointment even manifested itself publicly, when he demanded an explanation for why a slowdown in growth rates had not been avoided. Meanwhile, rising oil prices due to the war in Iran aren't helping the situation. Russian economists believe that for this to happen, oil prices must remain above $100 per barrel for at least a year. Russia's budget deficit has already grown to 2.5% of GDP, which is approximately 50% higher than the annual plan. To save the economy, which is also weakened by sanctions, the Russian government raised taxes this year. But to further combat the budget deficit, they need to cut spending or begin searching for new sources of revenue. For example, they are considering introducing an excess profit tax for some raw materials producers and banks. Job cuts are also reported in the Moscow government.